So, welcome everyone to the podcast for week 3 of Asia 398 Narrative Literature in Pre Modern India. Now, we're halfway through our month-long journey through one of the greatest stories ever told, the Rāmāyaṇa of Valmiki. And this is the week when actually the action is going to get really serious. Now, if you've joined us late, our hero, the Prince Rama of Ayodhya, who's perfectly handsome, perfectly good, a paragon of truth, justice, and glory, he's been kicked out of the kingdom where he was just about to be crowned the king. This is all because of a wicked stepmother of sorts, this severely misguided Kaikeyi, who wanted her own son to become the king. And so Rama puts on a simple garment made of bark cloth. He takes up his trusty bow and sets off to live in the Dandaka forests of central India for 14 years with his lovely wife Sita and his younger brother Lakshmana loyally by his side. And so now the harrowing adventure starts off in earnest. They're going to encounter many different demons, a particularly intriguing demoness named Shurpanakha, and then her mighty brother Ravana, the demon lord of Lanka, who kidnaps Sita and takes her to his palace back in Sri Lanka. Then, as they search madly for Sita, Rama and his brother are going to encounter monkeys, or vanaras, in Sugriva's monkey kingdom called Kishkindha. And eventually they manage to send out search parties, and finally the mighty monkey Hanuman finds out that Sita's in Sri Lanka and makes a bold leap south. We're going to spend this week trying to figure out what these demons and these monkeys might have stood for in the popular imagination of ancient India. Now, whether you believe that the Ramayana tells an authentically true story of actual events that really did happen in like 10,000 BC, or maybe you believe that it's an imaginary set of events told in a mythological epic, there's no denying that none of us have actually ever really seen Rakshasas or talking monkeys. Even if someone maybe claims to have encountered such creatures, it's usually under really unusual circumstances. You can't really just go to India and see them on the train or in shopping malls. Well, monkeys maybe, but not ones that can change size and talk and rule their own kingdoms. Now, anyway, my point is that audiences of Valmiki's epic, just like us, would have had to imagine what Rakshasas and Vanaras stood for, what they were, and this imaginary, as modern scholars have argued, comes out of key anxieties that were taking place actually in that early classical Indian time period that we've been kind of focused on. If you remember that phase 1 I talked about a couple of weeks ago, basically around 200 BC till 300 CE. The monkeys and the demons, especially the demons, are literary projections of all the things that people in this time found troubling about humans, traits that we wish humans didn't have. That way, the normative vision of Valmiki's Ramayana thinks of our heroes like Rama and Lakshmana as being ideal types that we can aspire to model our own lives after. Let's get back to these anxieties. I want to mention basically 2 different sites in which North Indian Hindu civilizations seem to have had serious fears and anxieties. One comes out of a problematic divide between urban and civilized spaces versus wild hinterlands that had developed in the same time period, starting around 500 BC. The other is a problematic division of what ideal life is supposed to be like for a civilized Hindu, where there was a division of the 4 aims of life. This is kind of what we're going to look at, and what I'd like to impress upon you in the podcast is that in books 3 and 4 of the Ramayana, we're going to see that when Rama travels out of the city and into the forest, when he leaves Hindu mainstream civilization behind, he finds that its inhabitants are prone to having severe imbalances in the 4 aims of life. This way, the Ramayana projects the negative features of the Hindu civilized self onto this imaginary construction of the fearsome other, the demons and the monkeys. In other words, if Rama, if you remember, is God in human form, what he finds in the forest is kind of a fantasy vision of what he most fears about his own humanity. So let's start with these cities in ancient India. Now, as I mentioned, cities arose in North India during a time that gets called the second urbanization of India. Now, this is roughly around 500 to 200 BC. What was the first urbanization, you might ask? Well, that was this Indus Valley civilization, which had grown up about 2,000 years even earlier than this second urbanization, and which died out a good 1,500 years before these new cities ever popped up. We can tell where these cities were, in general, from archaeological materials that we found coins, pots, artifacts, and so on, though we haven't really kind of dug up entire cities. Some of all of this is a bit of speculation, of course, and involves kind of exercises of matching place names that are found in Buddhist texts, largely in Jain texts, with these archaeological finds. But no matter what, we can easily tell is that the impetus for this kind of urban development and growth was the growth and founding, really, of inter-regional trade networks in ancient India. Basically, as regional kingdoms started trading with one another, the nodes in their networks of material exchange began to grow and develop into urban centers. Many of these were also centers of political power for an erstwhile set of kingdoms of ancient India, which were known as the 16 Mahajanapadas. Most of these actually were kind of brutally absorbed into the expanding Mauryan Empire based out of the eastern state of Magadha, modern Bihar. And then afterwards, when the Mauryan Empire disintegrated, like we said, around the year 185 BC, those old regional kingdoms, we can imagine, might have suddenly found themselves kind of able to assert some measure of political independence and power. So it might be tempting, actually, to imagine that the Ramayana might be doing a certain kind of historical project, right? That it could have been a way for Brahmin elites living in one particular regional power, the city-state of Ayodhya. The Buddhists call this Saketa, actually. They were maybe trying to imagine Ayodhya's own mythic, political, glorious past to kind of create a self-understanding that was remote from the time of the Mauryans, also from the Buddhists, the Jains, and other kind of more recent cultural impositions that they felt were being imposed upon them. So it was a way of maybe building up a community, but one that centered upon the realities of urban life, not village life. Um, so at this time, we can kind of imagine Hindu mainstream lifestyles as divided into sort of three different dimensions, right? First, there were urban spaces where primarily rulers and aristocrats, as well as wealthy merchants and artisans, were able to kind of assert their own forms of political or economic mercantile power. Brahmins had to go and work for these types as ministers, as teachers, as priests. Also coming to work for them were Buddhists and Jains. Bards would go to cities to get famous. Scholars would go to win debates. Right? Cities were this kind of free religious and cultural marketplaces in ancient India. Now, villages, on the other hand, were much more kind of regimented, more conservatively tied to ancient Vedic ritual practices and the kind of strict demands of agricultural life in this ancient world. Then there was also a third space. This is the one we're going to see now, the hinterlands that lay beyond the boundaries of these civilized kingdom spaces. These were wild wastelands and forests where only the most intrepid ascetic Brahmins and Vedic scholars went to set up their ashramas, their hermitages, and where Buddhists and Jain monks would also set up their own monasteries. These are often located in caves on tops of hills. The hinterlands were also where you could find Aboriginal and non-Vedic, non-Sanskrit speaking communities who, in some ways, seem to have been a perennial source of fear and anxiety for Brahmins and other kind of folks who were venturing out from the urban society into these rural or into these kind of forest hinterlands. This was a wild place, right? And so maybe inhabitants that Rama finds there, these demons and monkeys, may have represented kind of fantastic projections of the perceived wildness of those or Aboriginal communities who were living in the forest. Who knows? Pollock kind of argues against this idea that they represent the tribals in his Rakshasa article, but your guess really is as good as mine. No matter what, one of the driving anxieties behind the Ramayana we can be sure of is that uh, there was a need perceived in the Brahmin community for wanting to integrate the domains of the wild hinterlands with the civilized urban centers. The argument that the Ramayana tries to push, basically, for people living in cities is that kings who are living in these cities should be like Rama. They should aspire to ensure the security of Brahmins who've set up their forest ashramas out there in the wilderness and who felt quite vulnerable and helpless in the face of this fearsome other with a capital O, these inhabitants of the forest, in our case, the demons. Right? So, what was wrong with these demons that made them so scary to the Brahmin sages who were living in these forest ashramas, hermitages? Well, the basic details are pretty scary. They eat humans, they steal men's wives, they shapeshift, right? But on the kind of more subtle tip, the Rakshasas were dangerous because they didn't have a balance between what are called traditionally the four puruṣārthas, or the four aims of life. Now, what are these puruṣārthas? Well, they're easy to name in Sanskrit and memorize these names. You can. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. These were supposed to be the four domains in which a good man tried to aspire to live his life to the fullest. Dharma means being upright, leading a moral or ethical life. Artha, on the other hand, means power or wealth or accomplishment. Winning, as they kind of used to say on Twitter a few years ago. Kama is almost self evident. We can all understand it. It means pleasure, desire. The best kinds of pleasure, of course, above all other pleasures, are sexual. So often texts that discuss Kama spend most of the time talking about sex. But food, art, literature, poetry, dance, music, these are all different kinds of pleasures that were recognized as things to be enjoyed in ancient India. And in fact, one of the primary mandates for men in ancient India was to enjoy pleasures, not deny yourself. This actually brings me to another point, which is that these are specifically puruṣārthas, the aims of men's lives. Women in this kind of patriarchal and conservative vision of normative Hindu society were never really given subject positions in the puruṣārtha scheme, aside from being made to adhere to self-subordinating principles in the realm of dharma. So women who were asked to be righteous, like Sita was righteous, and subordinate their own interests either for the interests of their fathers, their husbands, or their sons. Right? The other place where we do occasionally see women who find themselves in subject positions is in the realm of Kama, where, in a kind of intriguingly forward thinking way of looking at sex, it was long recognized that women played necessarily active roles in sexual acts, and that it wouldn't be good if sex was not a mutually erotic activity. More on this later, actually, when we'll look at urban theater and the red light district of ancient India. Finally, the fourth realm of human life is denoted as moksha, or escape. The idea here is to quit all the other three aims of life and then leave social existence altogether in pursuit of liberating one's soul, one's atma, from the cycle of death, suffering, and rebirth. In the normative vision of society, which is actually fully operative within the Ramayana, the idea is that the members of the upper castes, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas should spend the most of their lives pursuing the first three of these aims during their lives, especially during the time after they get married and start working as householders. The final aim, the moksha, is something that men are supposed to pursue only after they retire, when their sons take over the family business and their property and so on. Again, I apologize for the repeated male-centric nature of this discussion, but in these early texts, like I said, women really just were never granted these subject positions. Instead, they were seen as objects largely of men's pleasure, as vehicles sometimes for their success, for their artha, in the form of being able to bear children, and then also as a vulnerable sector of society who needed to be protected and treated righteously in the realm of dharma. Now, if we just kind of forget about the fourth aim, just keep the first three aims of life in mind for a moment, what the Ramayana is going to do is to project failures in the balance of these three, dharma, artha, and kama, onto the demons and the monkeys that Rama encounters in the forest. Generally speaking, the demons either lack dharma entirely or they have a kind of severe dharma deficiency at best. Even if they have a little bit of dharma, it's very deficient. Their minds are fully chasing after sensual desires. They have this kind of uncontrollable greed for power. Monkeys, as we'll find out, really do have noble intentions. They want to have a balance between dharma, artha, and kama, but often their kind of animal instincts get the best of them, and they succumb to lapses in their moral and ethical standards when they kind of encounter power and pleasure pursuits. It's only humans, at least as represented by the ideal Rama, who can truly find a balance between dharma, artha, and kama, at least most of the time. As we're going to see in reading these two books of the Ramayana, there are some key moments when Rama kind of lets pleasure and power maybe get the best of him. So it seems, maybe. And maybe this perfectly righteous being is not so perfectly righteous after all. Well, that's really for you to decide and discuss and maybe argue in a paper or so. So let's take a break and get to our readings. Next week, we'll see what happens in books 6 and 7 of the Ramayana, and as some more really intriguing themes start to course through this incredible masterpiece of world literature.